When we left the EU, there was an expectation and, of course, a promise by the Brexiteers, indeed by Michael Gove, in a speech he titled, or at least was billed, as the Green Brexit, where, of course, he promised that there would be no lowering of environmental standards and that we would at least not only be on the same level as the EU, but even better. And, of course, unfortunately, well, as you know, those promises have not been kept. In fact, we are now very, very much in danger of essentially becoming a toxic dumping ground for some of the most dangerous chemicals out there that the EU has banned. And this, of course, is going to be a problem because, as we've said before, especially chemical dumping rules, they've been lowered. Almost next to no news coverage about that, which still shocks me that has happened. So if there is a spillage or anything like that, you don't even have to report what type of chemicals you're using to the government. So if there is a spillage, you can't be identified as that source, meaning you have to spend who knows how long trying to track down the sources of these of where this contamination will have come from. Companies may not want to do that, etc. Not only that, but chemical employees who work in chemical plants, we've seen reductions in their own personal safety be reduced as well. Just so much of this stuff, and especially when it comes to chemicals, will have a continuous impact on not only environmental safety, public health, all kinds of consequences this could have on us. So I'm really, really glad to hear today that a group called Fighting Dirty has now been granted its challenge for a hearing to the High Court to challenge the Environmental Agency over its lack of ability to test sewage sludge for chemicals and stuff that it now, so we say, regularly just gets dumped into rivers. And we've seen what the consequences of that in the past, that many river ecosystems are now collapsing. And yet, why the government has not done this is because in Europe, when we were in the EU, we had this army of scientists, of administrators, of testers to test these substances, to have a look at this. And of course, what did we say the government, this pro-Brexit government, this free market fundamentalist government, was always going to do when it came to sort of regulations and these types of police bodies that police these things? Well, they're not going to replicate them. So in some cases, they have replicated them, and then they haven't even fully staffed these bodies, not even fully funded these bodies. Or in case of this, where you do need a proper army of scientists and testers to be able to look at these chemicals, they're not even going to fund it. So, yeah, this is something that will be, I think, interesting to sort of keep an eye on what this goes on with. So we're going to go over to Fighting Dirty and have a look at their press release that they've put out about this, because I think it's kind of important to sort of highlight this challenge that's going on against the Environmental Agency over, once again, promises that the Brexiteers made, which they have not been able to keep. So, as always, before we do go getting on to this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, the donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can all buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, there's the Pony Club down below as well. So, let's go cracking on into this. Like I say, this comes from Fighting Dirty. This is their press release that they put out about this. So, the environmental campaign group Fighting Dirty has now been granted permission for the High Court to seek High Court hearing to challenge the Environmental Agency over its decision to axe a commitment to halving sewage sludge testing for microplastics for forever chemicals before it is spread on agricultural land as fertilizer. In a report commissioned by the Environmental Agency in 2017, it found that English crops were now contaminated with dangerous organic contaminants, including dolphins' fulfis, psychoplastic aromatic hydrocarbons, at levels that may even pertain a risk to human health. The physical contaminants include plastics that could result in soils becoming unsafe for agriculture. In light of those findings, in 2020, the Environmental Agency acknowledged that the, quote, do nothing option was available and committed to bringing in testing and regulation of sewage sludge from the water treatment plants and septic tanks to the environmental permitting regime by 2023. This measure would require all sewage to be tested for microplastics and forever chemicals before being sold to farmers by water companies for use as fertilizer. Again, As you can see, kind of important. This is why you need these regulatory bodies. This is why you need these regulations in place to do this type of testing. And the thing is, all this costs money. But of course, as you can see, if you don't do this, then you do massively risk a big risk to human health. That is not something that we should be sleeping on. But unfortunately, we've got a government who is just like, companies can just, do whatever they want, hang the consequences, because they are on that free market fundamentalist mindset of there should be no regulations whatsoever. That includes things like this. And this is the type of stuff they wanted to leave the EU and just completely have that bonfire of regulations to get rid of. So back to it. So, however, by July of 2023, no update has now been published. So, Fighting Dirty contacted the Environmental Agency to request information on what action would be taken. In response, the Environmental Agency informed Fighting Dirty that it had now updated the strategy for the Safety and Sustainable Sludge Use webpage. However, the updated strategy had completely abandoned commitment to achieve legislative change by 2023, a deadline, and failed to replace it with an alternative date, thereby reverting to a, quote, do nothing position. Very much probably encouraged by, again, the current environmental minister. Now, there is, of course, no timetable in place to enforce the removal of harmful chemicals from about 35 million tons of sewage that is spread on UK agricultural land as fertilizer every year. Fighting Dirty, which compromises campaigners from George Elliott Smith, George Minbert, Steve Hayward, is represented by the environmental legal team by League Day. And Fighting Dirty has been granted permission for a judicial review of the EA's decision to remove the deadline for action, and will argue in court that the body has now failed to consider mandatory relevant factors and make sufficient inquiries. That is now a decision not to replace the target date is irrational. So this is what was going to happen, that there would be just campaign groups now popping up saying, well, actually, when we're in the EU, we had all these protections. You said you were going to maintain these protections. This was one of the things you promised during Brexit, that you would maintain these. And of course, what does this all come down to? It comes down to what we've said. Just, we don't want regulations. We'd rather just throw them all away and just let businesses do whatever they want. But as you can see, not doing that should not be an option. You should have these protections, these bodies, and be willing to pay for these things in place, because if you pay for it now, then you avoid the massive environmental human problems that causes in the future. Because who's to say in like 10, 20 years time, you do not see a massive wave of people suing the government for not doing anything about this. So yeah, it might be a cost now to hire these army of scientists and examiners and etc. now, but in the long run, it will save you a heck of a lot of money. So we're just going to finish this off with some of these campaigns who they've said. So John Minbot has said that thousands of hectares of prime farmland are now being contaminated every year with a cocktail of toxic chemicals with scarcely any testing or even documentation. The government knows this is wrong, but is now serially failed to keep its promises to take action. Thanks to the regulatory black hole, no one knows exactly what is going into the land or what the consequences might be. They could very well be grim indeed, and we are going to hold the government to account for this monumental failure to protect the public interest. Georgia Elliott Smith said, as an environmental professional, I know that strong regulation is key to the direct investment and innovation towards tackling pollution. British industry is now struggling with the government's lack of direction, very weak contradictory regulations, underinvestment, and a constant state of uncertainty. By bringing this legal action, we are simply asking the Environmental Agency and DEFRA to actually deliver on what they promised several years ago, to implement an effective and timely permitting regime that prevents harm to human and the environmental health. Steve Haid, the policy manager at Not for Profit, said that today is a huge step forward to regaining a major source, to regulating a major source of pollution, microplastics, and toxic chemicals. The idea that we're now being knowingly spread these poisonous cocktails directly into our farmland without regulation or even control is horrifying. This represents a very serious dereliction of duty from those who are meant to be regulating this sector. by set to date to fix this, and then to stick to that time frame should be understood to be the very minimum of response to such environmental disaster. Once again, we are chasing for the very minimum of environmental regulation to be in place and enforced. So this is it. Even basic regulation requirements you would expect to be there are just not there because the government just has no interest. And one of the things we've said is that because regulation has been so talked about in the EU, in the EU, our parliament has not had to do this. It's not really had to talk about regulations for quite some time. And this is the conversations that campaigners like this and stuff you were seeing like this, like the Fighting Dirty taking the Environmental Agency to the High Court, is a exact action that we need to be seeing to order to get the public to realize, oh, actually, regulations quite important. Because remember, there is still that stigma there that exists that regulations, oh, well, that's all EU stuff. That was all just crazy, kooky, wrong stuff. No, all those environmental protections, all those regulations were there for a reason. And it is very difficult, as I've said multiple times before, to try and get people to actually realize that these regulations are important. As I've said, take me back to, because I worked in marketing when we were bringing in GDPR and all the rules and regulations around that. You will know of, again, people like myself who delivered those courses, or if you went to those courses, a big part of us was trying to scare the bejesus out of you that if you do not follow these rules and laws and regulations, you are going to get a significant fine. And yeah, it's true to some extent. You would, of course, receive a fine depending on what the information commissioner says. But again, also another office for the government that also chronically underfunded, chronically understaffed, has all these information complaints, but cannot deal with the level that they are getting because they're just so understaffed and underfunded to actually take care of some of this stuff. And again, we came up with that, and I always remember the first one that I went to was explicitly very much focused on scaring people. And I asked, why are you doing this? What's the aim of that? Well, he said, look, you've got to pay attention to this. And if I don't raise that alarm, if I don't say, well, actually, this is what the consequence if you don't follow all these, people won't stay awake. They won't pay attention. So it is very difficult trying to get regulations across to multiple people. And it's not even things like that. Things as simple as the important safety requirements of having washers. We're not talking like, washer tumble dries, but like washers, that the bolt and the safety requirements in and around that. How are you going to get like the British public and even talks in Parliament about the requirements for those? It's incredibly, incredibly difficult on this. So I am very, very heartened to see that we are having challenges by this, and I don't expect this to be the last of these challenges issued to the government. I'm expecting these challenges to come up quite regularly and quite frequently for the next couple of years, highlighting, of course, all the things that we had and the protections. And here's the thing: I think even Labour aren't really fully up on the ball when it comes to these regulations either, because it's just been something that our parliament has not had to deal with for a very, very long time. And it's something that they need to catch up on. We already know that they're regulating at an incredibly slow rate, but that's more because we've had a lot of chaos going on in this regard, and the reluctance to let these regulatory bodies, very much so, again, by the Brexiteers, the free market fundamentalists, to let them regulate at their own pace. So again, something that we would like to see a change if you get a Labour government in, allowing these bodies to dictate them their own freedom to regulate at their own case. So, yeah, very worrying, of course, but something not expected. We've been talking about this for, I don't know, quite a long time, since the original chemical deregulation came in a couple of years ago now, that barely anyone talked about at the time and barely even made any significant headlines. But there you go. So as always, thank you very much to everyone for watching today. Please remember to click on the like, share, and leave a comment down below on your way out. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.